I am Kerstin Wasson, the research coordinator of the Elkhorn Slough NERR, and I've been a member of the Wetlands and Water Levels Work Group for a long time. And on behalf of that work group, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our very first Wetlands and Water Levels Symposium, where we can celebrate the accomplishments of this interdisciplinary NERR initiative that's focused on understanding vegetation resilience in the face of changing water levels. And I just want to pause to acknowledge that these coastal wetlands where we work and where we do this science and the stewardship were home for millennia to Native Americans who sustainably stewarded the coastal wetlands before being forcibly removed and suffering unimaginable consequences. So we, as the NERR system, stand by the descendants of those people who are now trying to reconnect with this legacy of coastal stewardship. I wanted to start with just a little bit of history about the Wetlands and Water Levels Initiative. So this started at the 2008 NERR meeting, which was hosted by Elkhorn Slough. And NOAA leadership challenged us to come up with our signature initiative to address climate change resilience. And this is what we came up with. And we had a framework developed by 2011, which we then gradually implemented, refined, and expanded. Initially, this was called our Sentinel Site Application 1, but Sentinel Site was used for many different purposes, so we came up with a more specific name of the Wetlands and Water Levels application. And somebody's clicking, so if you're not muted, mute yourself, please. This is an initiative that's really always had enthusiastic support from across the NERRs, with education coordinators and coastal training program coordinators engaged, managers supporting it, strategic committee voting it as a priority, and as you see in this photo here, the RCs and SCs giving very enthusiastic support to the concept of making it a system-wide funded part of what we do. Of course, this is a focus on estuarine vegetation, which has such value for ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration and wildlife habitat, water quality, and protection from storms. In the past, our tidal marshes often did a good job tracking sea level rise, but in the future, with accelerated sea level rise and other issues from human activities, some tidal marshes may not be able to rise to this challenge. And just as a little aside, this is very tidal marsh focused, but the Wetlands and Water Levels application has its own variant for the Great Lakes, which are affected by changing lake levels. So in the face of accelerating sea level rise, we really need to know which marshes are resilient, such as this lovely one in Elkhorn Slough or Narragansett Bay, or which are vulnerable, such as this drowning marsh in Elkhorn Slough or Narragansett Bay. This visual here kind of encapsulates what the Wetlands and Water Levels Initiative is all about, is really trying to understand resilience versus vulnerability. And we do this by monitoring 5 different categories of indicators of resilience: the vegetation itself and its elevation change rate, which is related to sediment supply, the tidal range and where the vegetation sits in the tidal frame, and the rate of sea level rise. So we have really consistent, robust monitoring protocols that we've developed over the years and that we implement across the reserves. But what's important is that this is not just monitoring, it's an application. So those data are applied to restoration and conservation, to informing coastal decision makers, and to education and outreach. So as an example of application to management, Our Mars indices that synthesize data can be linked to, if you have a high score, you should protect the marsh, moderate, you should restore it, and low, you'd better create some new opportunities. And so this sort of information is, of course, critical for coastal decision makers, and many coastal training program coordinators have held workshops around the reserve on these topics. A few years ago, we synthesized what some of the different workshops were that had been held on this topic. And likewise, the wetlands and water levels work is really important for education and for outreach. And education coordinators summarized all the different ways they use the data, from tote workshops, you'll hear about that from Virginia, to field trips, hauling scullers, exhibits, and so on. And this is just one example of a lesson plan booklet focused on these data. So I just have to put in a little plug that our system is doing really well at getting the wetlands and water levels application up and running, but if funding could be found in a one-time way to get us all across the finish line, it really wouldn't take much. Most reserves are most of the way there, but need, say, a bit more infrastructure and some funding to develop those local applications, a tote workshop or a template for a training, decision maker training workshop. Then beyond that, once we're all up and running, we will, in the long run, need annual budget for our multiple sectors at each reserve, as well as for the CDMO to implement this system-wide in the long term. So that is my quick overview of the Wetlands and Water Levels Initiative. I guess my daughter's texting should be turned off. It really is our signature initiative that makes the NERRs a leader in estuarine climate change science, management, and outreach. Today we have a packed agenda with 13 different speakers, and we've divided this up into sort of 3 sections. The first is looking at, oh, actually, Megan, not quite yet. Sorry. Looking at management and outreach applications. The second is regional and national syntheses. And the last is case studies applying this to local science and management needs. And assuming we stay on schedule, we'll have a brief break before the second and the third block. Each speaker is going to talk for 8 minutes. You're going to hear a little bell at 7 minutes that will tell the speaker they have 1 minute to wrap up. And we would like to invite you guys to be actively engaged and put your comments, compliments, emojis, whatever in the chat, and to chat amongst yourselves there. This is an informal meeting, and that just makes it feel more lively. But we are also going to use the chat to have questions for the speakers, and so we can tell those apart. I'm going to ask you to put Q : and the speaker's name, as in Q, Megan, has Phragmites increased over time? That way the speaker can find them at the end, and if they're on time, they may be able to answer a question out loud, but for the most part, they will answer them in the chat after they have spoken. So now Megan can grab the screen share. Our first speaker of today is Megan Tyrell and Hilary Sullivan from Wacoit Bay NERR.